Today I'm joined by Mike Fitzsimmons, CEO of Crosschq. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, glad to be here.
Now, Mike, my understanding is that you went to Hampden Sydney College, which is a men's liberal arts college in Virginia. I guess it's one of the 10 oldest colleges in the United States. What was that experience like?
It was definitely different. I'll tell you, the primary reason I chose to go to school there was for athletic reasons. So it was frankly the only college that was interested in having me play soccer at the time. So I took advantage of that. But it was a super unique experience. And as you mentioned, it's one of only 3 all-male liberal arts colleges left in the United States. And so it's a different kind of learning environments for sure.
So since you didn't have the co-ed experience, what did you guys do in terms of, that co-ed experience, whether it's parties or something off campus?
Yeah, this is going to sound like something out of the 1950s, but there were 6 all-women colleges within 2 hours of the school. So there was definitely from Thursday to Sunday, the buses would start coming in and the fun would begin.
It's funny. I could literally envision the 1950s movies playing in the background. So I see the whole thing. Now, when I look at your career, something that seems to be a common thread in your work history is MarTech. You are a serial entrepreneur and also sports. You mentioned soccer, but you seem to also promote a lot of sports-oriented type of ventures as well. Tell us about your passions.
Yeah, no, it's been an interesting journey for sure, and just a little bit more backstory. So my parents emigrated to this country. I was the only one of my 4 siblings born in the U.S., so they kind of came over here penniless, the story, and created their world from scratch. We moved around 8 times in my youth. I was actually born in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places, but we moved around quite a bit. And early and often, I was just studying my father and just watching him grind through his career. He ultimately was in the retail business. He was one of the early guys at a company called Centricity, if you remember that business. So I started interning at Circuit City when I was 15. I worked every vacation, every summer, all the way through college, and that was so I think I had 7 or 8 years of commercial experience by the time I had graduated from college. So that's sort of what got me started in the general sort of MarTech. Retail, entertainment, et cetera, was all through that Circuit City experience.
Well, I think for some of the millennials and the Gen Zs that watch this show, they probably don't know what a Circuit City is, but I would imagine that being out there on the floor, as well as at the corporate headquarters, you were forced to really focus on customer centricity, right?
Yeah, exactly. And one of the first real jobs I had was in the call center there working. Circuit City had their own private label credit card. That's where they made all their money, was warranties and credit cards. There was no money selling big screen televisions, but it was dealing with delinquent credit card holders and having to make the outbound calls from a collections basis to try and get them to pay. And I learned more in that experience just about the realities of the world, how credit works fundamentally, but just the realities of the world and how people fall in hard times and how all of that stuff works. And I must have been 17, frankly, when I started picking up on some of those early observations.
Well, we're going to come back to that because you also volunteer at an organization called DeFi of Northern California, which I think is a very interesting organization. But let's get into the heart of this conversation, which is around your startup, Crosschq.
Yeah.
Tell us about the genesis of this.
Yeah. So, and just a smidge more on how I got here. I actually kind of emigrated myself to the West Coast in Silicon Valley during the .com boom. I said, I've got to get out of Virginia, and get a piece of this. So I kind of came over here, not knowing a person, just starting my career. I'm like, I'm gonna go, packed my car and did the thing and drove across the country and ended up in San Francisco and planted a flag. And that was 20 plus years ago. I initially jumped on with a startup that we ultimately sold to CNET. And then out of that, I started my first company by myself. And this company was a 10-year run. We raised a bunch of venture financing. We got it to a couple $100 million in revenue pre-IPO. And I learned a couple of really hard lessons. And you asked the question earlier, and I listened to some of your other conversations around just, how do you succeed and all that good stuff. And this was failure. It really was. For all the hard work and grit, we didn't get to where we, hoped to get to. And a big reason why we didn't was some hiring mistakes we made in sort of the critical final stretch of that company. One was a head of sales, one was a CFO, and it ultimately became the catalyst for what Crosschq is. So that's where this company was born from, was really my own personal experiences running a $100 million plus organization and learning the hard way of just how hard it can be, and coming to the conclusion that the enterprise just needs better tools. This is too big of the stakes are too high as it relates to talent in organizations, and we just need to provide better tools for enterprises to make better hires. So that's where this whole thing came from.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you've gone through multiple life cycles of a company, you know that every stage requires a different type and a caliber of talent. So I think it's a great point that you make in terms of the fact that not having that perfect fit for the CFO as well as the head of sales was so critical for that operation and growth stage. Let's get into some of the kind of nuts and bolts. Crosschq is coining a term called human intelligence hiring, which really you guys are looking to innovate around candidate reference checks. So my first question is, how do you overcome some of the challenges and kind of the biasness that exists with survey approach? The fact that references are selected by candidates, I believe, doesn't that already have bias?
Yeah, so I will say, and before I answer that question, just the human intelligence hiring piece, when we set out to start Crosschq, as any, I hope, entrepreneur, we don't want to be sort of a gap in the existing Gartner quadrant, right? That's not what this is about. We said we're going to redefine a new quadrant. We're going to create a whole new category of how talent and companies are matched, and it's going to be driven by this concept of human intelligence, which is fundamentally based on what do people think about me and what do I think about myself. So with that being said, when we look at the existing process, talk about just from a bias perspective, it's just littered with bias. Who you talk to, doing a reference check, when you talk to them, what questions you ask them, how you memorialize and capture the data you get off of those conversations. Like we truly, you hear all the time people saying, hey, I like to do the live reference because I can pick up on the tone of what the person is saying. Like there's no more biased, thing to adopt than that strategy. It's no good. That doesn't work in today's day and age. So from a starting point, having a structured set of questions, structured set of answers, everyone's getting the same questions in the same amount of time and answering, upon the same basic format and template, we think as a starting point absolutely is, 10x better than the current practices. I think as it relates to the bias of the people that are actually giving the feedback through the Crosschq system, there's a couple of ways that we've addressed this. The first way we address this is just our methodology, and this is how I talk to you, Scott, if you were my reference. So when you get an invitation into Crosschq to do a reference on Mike, the questions we're asking you actually can't say anything bad about me. Everything is sort of done on a good to great scale. We're really trying to put you in a comfortable environment to give us authentic and honest feedback, not be my PR agent, right? Because that doesn't do anybody any good. You're just going to say you're great and all this good stuff, but really be honest. And so we can help ensure that you are well matched for the company and the job that you're applying for. And so that has resulted in people being honest and super, super honest. So the notion that these are primary references, you're giving my references, they're going to be biased and just say all nice things about me, it's not happening. It's amazing. And this is what's remarkable and just so exciting about what we are learning is that, people don't want to deceive. They really don't in their core. And if they're presented with the opportunity of Scott as my references, wants me to make sure I'm in the right job, he's going to be honest. And that's what we're learning, that we've created an environment to certainly enable people to be honest and authentic with their feedback. And it's awesome to see it back.
I really like the methodology and how you're trying to allow for them to have that transparency and that objectivity come out in a kind of essentially safe environment. As far as a 360 holistic review, self and others, do you assign higher weights to, let's say, a supervisor versus a direct colleague or even a staff or somebody that's not even within the organization?
There's so many great, cool insights coming out of this, and you're right on it. As we're getting more data into this engine, we're like scratching our heads, like, where do we go? It's so great. But some just radical insights for you as an example. Easy, obvious ones. Peer references tend to be about 11% higher on average. Manager references a little bit tougher. We can weight them in the system differently. There's also an interesting dynamic just in terms of who the person giving the references and what their own background is. It's just there's some interesting dynamics in that side. But some other things that we're learning, 43% for Bay Area, Silicon Valley, what we would call startup tech companies, 43% of primary references, i.e. the references that you're giving, you're suggesting on yourself, are peers, existing peers. Mm. And that's a phenomenon that I personally in my career would never give a peer reference, during my interview process, right? But we're learning so much about the sort of tribal nature of the millennial and the sort of Gen Z workforce that is just different. And we're sort of all, we're not, it's not a fully baked thought yet as we get more data in the system, but there's something happening there that's phenomenal. And it's just really interesting to observe. So But yeah, I mean, there's a ton of data coming into the system. There's a ton that we're getting smarter about it. And also context matters big time. It's understanding what the company that the person was giving you a reference from. We had a fabulous candidate come through the system. Her former manager had given her really high marks across the board. Two managers before had given her a lot lower marks. When the engine did its work, we realized that she had been laid off from the first company, and that person felt so guilty for laying her off that she was trying to help her out in, inflating the math. So there's work to do on how to normalize all of that and how to, get the data to do the talking. But I will say, what really you're looking for in the process of human intelligence is consistency. What you're really looking for, we're interviewing you, we've reviewed your resume, we think you are strong in these various dimensions. When we start talking to your peers, your managers, your mentors and whatnot, as long as they're verifying on those dimensions, it's when we start to see outliers, right? That's when the data starts to say, I should go deeper and ask some more questions. That's really where the power lies. And so it's less a function, frankly, of the direct relationship that we have and more a function of, are they saying generally the same things about this individual, or are they all over the map? And if they're all over the map, we've got to go do a bit more work.
Yeah, that's really interesting from a statistical and data analytics is that you're looking for not just the mean, you're looking for the deviations, and those anomalies gives you hints in terms of, like you said, the consistency. It's essentially your platform is a truth meter in a way. One of the follow-up questions that I had is, as you're building out your platform, there's only so much data that you currently have. So how do you pull in additional data that's GDPR compliant and privacy compliant from places like LinkedIn that already has a very vast set of social graphs and clusters? So you can start to understand which cluster does this candidate belong in, who are the peers, where are they at, what positions, how long have they been. So you start to draw not just inferences from the references and the candidate, but from the cluster.
Great question. And there's a couple of things we're doing that I think are really cool. One is, and when we started, as you probably heard from my beginning of this conversation, I was coming from a position of screen out the bad guys. I really was. My passion was, I'm angry, I'm going to solve this problem, right? This costs my employees and my investors, that sort of thing. And what we've learned really is this is a two-sided problem. This is really about the talent and the companies. It's just as painful for talent to end up in the wrong job as it is for companies to hire the wrong talent, right? It really, truly is. So we're dialed in on that. And to that end, one piece in terms of just getting more data into the system, the whole concept of back channeling. We initially had built out this really cool back channel engine that was programmatic, and I could identify Scott's reference graph, and I could programmatically create a reference graph on you, and then the engine could actually go out and solicit back channel references to complement the primary references, right? So first thing we started was that we're not calling them back channel anymore. And from a GDPR perspective and transparency and candidate rights perspective, I actually think the notion of back channel references in 2 to 3 years is going to be gone. I think it's totally unfair to the candidate, and it's a poor practice. Everybody does it. I don't see that lasting. First of all, we rebranded that, called those secondary references. The other cool thing that we did, though, is rather than have that be a company-sided deal, we flipped the script. So we're serving those secondary references back to the candidate and saying, hey, Scott, you've already given us 4 or 5. You didn't give us anybody from XYZ Co. Right? You didn't give us anybody from here. Do you mind giving us a few more? You don't have to, right? You really don't have to. But the talent and the real stars are going to say, bring it. They really are. They're like, I'll give you 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more. Which is also sort of a bit of where we're going, where you're going to be able to portably take your references with you. They're your data. You can take them from place to place with you, and that sort of thing, right? That's how we're kind of flipping that script. So that's one piece in just terms of extending the reference graph, getting more data into the system, just getting more statistical significance to the data, and removing some of the bias that you had talked about earlier of just giving your best 3 friends. The other thing that we're doing, though, from a predictive perspective, is we're starting to tap into the performance management systems at these companies and their HRIS systems to get performance reviews. Simple things like tenure. Are you still there? What type of performer were you? Average, above average, below average, right? So the engine's going to get really, really great. Just give us a couple of cycles here where we're going to be able to predict a Crosschq score against a tenure predictor and a performance predictor. And you can just imagine, once a company gets a year worth of data in our system, it's going to be awesome, right? So that's part of how we're using third-party data sources. LinkedIn, with the new ruling and all that good stuff, there's some awesome things we can do to help drive our reference graph, as an example, help make that a little bit smarter. There's also cool things we can do, like on the tenure measuring. We can suck in LinkedIn data just to see if you're still at the company versus having to go through the performance management system, that sort of thing. So there's opportunities there for us to take advantage of some of those data sources. But today, we really are doing it primarily driven out of the Crosschq system and plugging in sort of where and when it makes sense.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much for telling us about the product roadmap and some of the ways you guys are integrating. Because ultimately, if you have access to some of these data stores within the companies, you're able to get tremendous training as well as insights, predictive insights. Let's talk briefly, just to set context for the listeners. Crosschq is a relatively new company. You officially launched a product sometime earlier this year, but you're getting great traction. If you had to kind of isolate it down to the quintessence of why, what do you think is the biggest value proposition?
Yeah, I think that it just the war on talent. Let's just be really, really real. It's hand-to-hand combat right now, and in virtually every sector. So we have to get it right. And I think there's a collective reckoning amongst HR tech and talent professionals that the stakes are so great, right? That we need to get it right. I think the other thing that's happening, and this is just my view, you're seeing a generation of leaders in the people and talent space at these companies that are open-minded about technology, about data, about AI. Like these are folks that have grown up in this generation, and with all due respect, there was just a generation of leaders in the people space that weren't as technology, they weren't as technology centric, and subsequently weren't as open-minded about doing things like this. This is a pretty big, shift, right, in terms of how these companies have been doing this, and we're playing with some very valuable and rich and sensitive human data about people, right? This is sort of no joke. So I think that's a big piece. I think there's just a shift in terms of openness and innovation from the thought leaders and the people and the talent leaders at these organizations. It's a big part of it, coupled with this sort of perfect storm of, making sure we get these hires right. The math is, the data, 1 out of 6 new hires don't make it 6 months, 47% don't make it 18 months, right? Just some of the simple math. The average cost of a bad hire collectively is estimated between 15 to 5 times, 15,000 to 5 times the salary based on the role and that sort of thing. There's all kinds of data out there. I think people collectively understand that. They don't have a P&L line item for the bad hire problem. They don't acknowledge it, but they all know it exists. And so we sort of talk about this as carbon monoxide, frankly, when we're talking to companies. Like, this is that thing, it's a killer. And when it gets you, it's paining you, but you don't acknowledge it until it's too late. So I think there's just a collective awakening about how valuable and how high the stakes are, and that, man, technology and data in this day and age can do all kinds of wonderful things. So I think that's the foundation of why.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it, Mike. I appreciate that. Let's now transition to talk about the kind of the focus of this podcast, which is around innovation. And I think because you've been doing AI for some time, you understand the value of pattern recognition. You've had series of successes. Many times entrepreneurs will have series of failures, and you did preface a little bit of that at the beginning, but I think you've had enough successes to see some key patterns emerge. If you had to isolate to 1 or 2 kind of the strongest statistically significant set of variables, what would that be, and what's that advice that you would give to entrepreneurs?
And just at a macro level for starting a new venture kind of thing?
Yes.
So look, I think there's 2 things I think about personally as I invest, and also when I decided to jump into this, and it's team and TAM. It's really that straightforward for me, right? TAM first. Is this market big enough and disruptible, right? And then team, right? And can I get the team around me to go and win? And I think a lot of the other stuff falls in from there. And if you can't credibly answer those 2 questions, it's probably not a good use of your time, and go find something else to go do. And look, I was nervous about that coming into this experience. I don't know a thing about the HR tech space. My network, as you observed earlier, I know everybody in the media landscape. I know everybody in the advertising, sports, entertainment land. Not everybody, but my network is deep there. This was new. I had to kind of go through a personal reinvention, right, to kind of get into this space and all that good stuff. And so I was cautious about that, and I had to look in the mirror and ask myself that question. But I think those 2 things are just so important. I think we find these businesses that try and start, and it's a gap in a market, not a market in a gap. I know that's a cliche, but it's real. And you got to make sure that it's a big enough opportunity, because these are hard. We don't accept that this is 7 to 10 years of your life when you're starting one of these things. It's real, right? That's the fact, and the odds of failure are high, right? So knowing that those 2 inputs, you better make sure it's a big enough prize at the other side, and you better make sure you can surround yourself with the right talent to go and win. So those are my, in a really simplistic fashion, those are the things that come to mind when you ask the question.
And I think that also jives in the sense that because you're a VC, that's also the same thing that you would be looking for, correct? I mean, you want to make sure that total addressable market size is big enough because you want a large enough of a liquidity event.
Correct. Yeah. And for these businesses, you've got to capture the imagination of this investor community, right? And they're hard to do organically. They're hard to do without that, that catalyst and that fuel that these VCs and these investors give you. So I think, of course, yeah, those things line up.
So we only have 1 minute left. Let's talk about this nonprofit that you're involved with, which is Defy Northern California. Tell us real briefly what it is and how that aligns with what you're doing at Crosschq.
Yeah, it's amazing how these things cross over almost coincidentally. So I was exposed to Defy Ventures from a colleague, actually, and I went and checked it out and just totally fell in love with it. And really just from a perspective of second chance. And we all need to do our part to help those less fortunate, win. And the irony is, from that experience, we already at Crosschq had signed a partnership with a company called 70 Million Jobs, which is a Greylock-backed job marketplace for ex-convicts, believe it or not. So where they're trying to prevent, it's an anti-recidivism play, get these guys back in the workforce, keep them from going back to prison. They're using Crosschq at the very top of the funnel, which is awesome. So these guys have broken resumes, fragmented work histories. They've been in jail, for God's sake. But what they do have, if they've worked on themselves, is mentors and other people that will, on their behalf, vouch for them, for lack of a better term. So they're literally running cross-checks on these individuals right when they're out, entering the workforce, and that's part of their application for the job, right? Their resume, as we've traditionally done, and their cross-check report. I just think it's the coolest thing. So we're underwriting that, and we're just big believers. We're working on other Elite Meet, which is the Navy SEALs version of that, where they're helping SEALs that have been in the, working to protect our country, re-entering the workforce. Same concept. So where Crosschq can be used as a way to help level the playing field, drive fair hiring practices, get overlooked people a better shot at getting a job, all that good stuff. So I'm fired up about it. I think it's awesome. Defy also obviously represents that in a hands-on basis, but that's how these things kind of connect, if you will.
Well, I'm really excited. I think this is now starting to make a lot of sense, and I see the profound public good that you can also provide through this platform as well. So today I've been joined by Mike Fitzsimmons, CEO of Crosschq. Mike, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for joining.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Scott. Have a great day.